The Old Testament, Hebrew scripture, the Tanakh, they're all really the same thing, but some people have an issue with that. So let's actually see that in play.
The Old Testament is not a Jewish book.
So, yes, the Old Testament is a Jewish book. It's really just taking the Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible, and it's putting it within the Christian Bible. Now, one of the things that we will have to understand while we go through this is that Christianity began within Judaism. So, even the writings of the Christians, at least the early Christians, were within this Jewish framework. But let's continue.
One of the things that I find so fascinating is how so many people think that Christian ideologies are Jewish ones.
So while Christian ideologies as a whole may not be Jewish ones, they're at least based on those ideas. So when we look at Christianity, again, it began forming within Judaism, and it took a lot of these ideas that were found in Judaism and kind of evolved them into something different. Now, this was a slow process that happened over many different years and with many different thinkers, but yeah, Christianity began as a part of Judaism and it evolves out of that. Now, over time, we do have different ideologies within Christianity that aren't firmly rooted within Jewish thought, but a lot of the basic ideas, a lot of the foundational works are in fact rooted within Judaism.
Now, to be fair, Judaism is the oldest Abrahamic religion. It predates Christianity and Islam.
That's completely true. I really don't have anything to debate about that. But when we actually are looking at these Abrahamic faiths, what happens is you have them building upon each other. So you have Judaism as kind of the original one, and then Christianity comes along. It forms with inside of Judaism, and then it builds upon that foundation. Now, when you have Islam coming about, you're having Islam basically building itself upon Judaism and Christianity, but it doesn't actually form within either one of those. It forms outside of those, and then kind of co-ops those other ideas. So even within Islam, we see some Jewish ideologies that are being borrowed, and that's a key point that we have to understand. While these ideas may not be specifically Jewish, they are in fact inspired by Judaism to different degrees.
Now, there are a lot of similarities between the three religions.
Yeah, there's a ton of similarities because Christianity began as a sect of Judaism, and it's just basically adopting those ideas and expanding on it. So, of course, there's a lot of similarities because Christianity, again, began as a form of Judaism. And this is something that you have to understand if you're going to actually understand what Christianity is.
But when things get changed, they stop being Judaism.
Sure, Christianity does stop being Judaism, but it wasn't because things were just being changed. If we look at Judaism in itself, you have a variety of ideas that are being changed throughout time. And we see that even by the Second Temple period, that's not the same Judaism that someone like, say, Moses would have practiced or that King David would have practiced. Judaism by that time had changed drastically, had been influenced by other ideas, and had adopted some of those different stances. And because of that, you have Judaism, which is kind of a living religion that adapts and changes over time. And this is what we see with most religions. So yeah, at some point, if you change it enough, it becomes something else. And this is what we see with Christianity. Christianity began as a sect of Judaism, but over time, because of different divisions, different disagreements, there was a split that completely separated the two. And it's not necessarily that they were changing things, but it was because of this infighting that happened based on a variety of different factors in the past. But yeah, if you do change something enough, it will become something different. But just because you're changing something doesn't mean that it ceases to exist as that previous something. And we can look at this within Judaism that changes drastically over the years.
Both the Old Testament and the New Testament are Christian books.
So while the Old Testament and the New Testament are technically Christian books today, they were actually formed within Jewish thought. They were written by Jewish individuals. The Old Testament as a whole was adopted by Christians from Judaism. So all the Old Testament texts are Jewish texts through and through, and they're still texts that Jews use today. Now when we look at the New Testament, there is something a little bit different there because When we are looking at the New Testament, it wasn't adopted by Judaism at all, but these texts are written by Jews. For instance, Paul was a Pharisee. He is promoting Pharisaic ideas, but he is also presenting these to Gentiles. He's kind of opening up this faith to a larger audience. Now, he's not doing this because he's separating from Judaism. He's doing this specifically because he is Jewish and he's understanding the Jewish scripture in this manner, that at the end of times, this path would actually open up to everyone, that everyone would kneel before the name of the Lord, that everyone would bow before that and pray to God. So Paul is actually taking Jewish ideas and simply running with them. This is what we see when we look at New Testament texts. They're all written by Jewish individuals who are operating within this Jewish framework, and they're kind of navigating from there. So while the New Testament isn't technically a Jewish, piece of scripture, it is a Jewish work in that it was created by Jews within this Jewish framework.
Jewish people follow and read the Torah.
Jewish people do follow and read the Torah, but so do Christians. When we look at the Old Testament, the Torah is the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books of Moses. It is the first 5 books within the Old Testament. Now, when we look at Jewish scripture, that's the same. When we look at the Torah, it's just the first 5 books of the Tanakh. It's the first 5 books of the scripture. It's the books supposedly written by Moses. This doesn't change between Judaism and Christianity. And one of the things that we need to point out is that Judaism doesn't simply follow the Torah. It's not their only piece of scripture. They have the Tanakh, which is the Torah, the law, as well as the prophets and the writings. It's the same things that we see within the Old Testament. Now, you also have the Talmud, which is the oral Torah. It's kind of a secondary text that they also use, but it doesn't rise to the level of scripture. But there is also that, and simply it's fascinating. It's one of the things that I'm trying to learn more about, because I think if you're going to learn about Christianity, you need to learn about the background, and the Talmud has a lot of that background in it. It has all of the background Jewish information, Jewish ideas that were circulating, maybe not at the exact same time as the New Testament writings, but it does have some of the stuff that does connect there. So that's one of the things I'm doing, but that's completely besides the point. The fact is, Jews do use the Torah, so do Christians, but they both use more than just that.
The Old Testament is like, because I have read it before, is like a Cliff Note version of the Torah.
So honestly, I don't think she has ever read the Old Testament, because if she read the Old Testament, she would know that it's not some Cliff Notes version, it's not some condensed version of the Torah. She would know, as soon as she opened it, that the first 5 books within the Old Testament are the Torah. It's the same thing as she would see if she opened up a Jewish Bible. Now, when you go beyond that, beyond the Torah, what you see are the writings and the prophets, the same works that you see within the Tanakh. So I highly doubt that she's ever actually read the Old Testament, because if she did, she would see that it basically resembles the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. Now, the difference between the Old Testament and the Tanakh is largely how things are ordered. And this is really talking about the Protestant canon, not the Catholic canon that has some extra books. Here we're just looking at the Protestant canon. So when we look at these two things, we see all the same books, we see all the same scripture, but they're organized differently. Now, the big difference that you often see between the Old Testament and the Tanakh is simply how later people interpreted it. Because even though when we look at Christian scripture, they are interpreting the Old Testament or the Tanakh in the same manner that Jews did, this interpretation will eventually go further, and then eventually it's used to point back to Jesus. Now, obviously, when Jewish individuals are reading the Tanakh, they don't see Jesus there. That is a Christian interpretation, but they're both looking at the same texts. But here's the thing, if you take a modern translation of the Old Testament, say the New Revised Standard Version or the Updated Edition, you really get a lot of those ideas being stripped away. You don't get a Christian interpretation of the text, you get a more neutral interpretation of the text, which will tell you that, hey, this is how Jewish people have really understood these passages throughout history. Some Christians have understood it this way, and you get more of a neutral view there. So yeah, when you're looking at the Tanakh in the Old Testament, you're really not getting two separate ideas. You're getting the same text, they're just organized differently. And this is exactly why I don't think that this individual has read the Old Testament, because if she had, she would have seen that, well, this looks very familiar, it's just out of order. It's not that this is a Cliff Notes version or a condensed version, because that simply makes no sense.
And one of the commandments in the Torah is that we are not allowed to change a single letter.
So the Torah doesn't really say that you can't change a single letter. In Deuteronomy 4:2, as well as elsewhere, we see Moses saying not to add or take away anything from which God commands. This is rather a common prohibition that we see within Semitic texts from this period, so it's nothing really unique. Now, this is most likely specifically addressing the instructions, the commandments that God has given, not the Torah as a whole. But even if we expand it to the entire Torah, the big issue is that we know that we don't have the originals, meaning it is a certainty that there has been some changes to the text. We can see that clearly when we compare the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic texts. There are variations between the two. Now these differences, these variations, are not generally substantial, but letters most likely have been changed because the texts are not word for word the same. But diving a bit further here, the idea that she's portraying here, the concept of not changing even a letter, comes more out of later rabbinic literature. For instance, we can find it in the Talmud in Eruvin 13a, where we have Rabbi Yishmael stating that omitting or adding even a single letter out of place can destroy the entire world. It can change the meaning from truth to death. As is often the case, though, the Talmud has more than one view on this topic. In Kedushin 30a, there's a discussion about possible variations within scrolls regarding plain and defective spellings or full and short spellings. Then when we get into the traditions and rules for copying the Torah, there's a lot that goes into all of this, which is truly interesting. I honestly had no idea about all this stuff. But it's really rather irrelevant here because all of this really deals more with handwritten Torah scrolls, not printed volumes. With printed versions, you generally don't have the strict layout rules and guidelines because these are not really being used in the same manner. But more than this, when we look at the Torah within the Old Testament, it is largely the same. Most modern translations of the Old Testament are using the Masoretic text as a base, and in fact, when we look at other versions of the Old Testament, we do have some translations that basically just relied on the Masoretic text as a whole. Now, where Christian translations do diverge from Jewish ones is that modern translations don't rely solely on the Masoretic text. Often translations, like the NRSV, will also utilize other ancient texts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, to better try to figure out what the original text truly read. This is just part of the field of textual criticism, where texts are examined, and through that, we attempt to figure out what the oldest readings would have been like. The differences, though, are minimal at best, and most of the differences are regulated to footnotes that explain that other ancient witnesses read something else. So as I said, it's largely irrelevant.
Once it's been condensed, it stops being our book.
The Old Testament does not condense the Torah. It contains the Torah. It also contains the prophets and the writings, just as the Tanakh does. Unless she wants to argue that the Tanakh somehow condenses the Torah, which makes no sense, then her argument doesn't work here.
You know what hasn't changed? We all follow and read the same Torah down to the letter.
She goes on to explain how even though Jews all around the world come to the faith differently, had different traditions, the one thing that they have in common is how they read the Torah, which is a weird argument because Christians read the same Torah as well. They don't have a different Torah. And yet she seems completely unaware of this, and unaware that the Old Testament is actually the Tanakh, just ordered differently. Here's the thing, while we may all read the same text, how we interpret it is different. And it's not just that Christians and Jews interpret the Torah differently, even though they do. There are also different Jewish interpretations of the Torah. It's why we have the Mishnah, the first written collection of the oral Torah, a collection that contains a variety of different interpretations, because people have always read the text differently. While we are all reading the same words, how we read them has been different, well, forever. Now, we can say certain readings are just better and more historically accurate, but for others, well, they tend to be up in the air. This division that she is creating here, it's just so grossly misinformed on this aspect that it isn't really needed. It's why we need better religious literacy, so we can understand other people's faiths in a fair and balanced manner.